Scripps colleague in American Studies, Matthew Delmont, for joining us to continue our semester-long inquiry into schooling in mass societies. Matthew Delmont is the author of the forthcoming book, The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand and School Segregation in Post-War Philadelphia. As that book title makes clear, Matthew Delmont's work is distinguished by its contextualization. I would say its multiple contextualizations of schooling. So the segregation of Philadelphia schools is related to the organization of the popular musical variety show that aired in various versions starting in the 1950s. Delmont's previous publications include the article, The Plight of the Able Student, Ruth Right Hair and the Struggle for Equality in Philadelphia's Black High Schools, 1955 to 1965. First and foremost, that article gives us a nuanced appreciation of the work and accomplishments of Ruth Right Hair, the first African-American principal in Philadelphia schools. In addition, the article makes an important contribution, I really found this quite illuminating for myself in terms of my own work. It makes an important contribution to our understanding of James Conant, a key figure in both the history of education and the history of the atom bomb. And it does so by showing us how Conant's famous vision of meritocratic schooling was received and adapted by Ruth Right Hair in her efforts to serve students, specifically disadvantaged students of color, who didn't meet Conant's standards of gifted, but who were, Right Hair insisted, profoundly able students. That article also accomplishes, I think, the sad task of the historian in demanding that we recognize that many able and passionate persons before us have pursued the struggle to provide educational opportunity and educational equality in the United States, and yet that struggle is still so far from really accomplishing its important goals. And that's that historical sense of how long-standing that struggle is that we're still with today to get somewhere close to educational opportunity and educational equality. It's a great pleasure and a real honor both to welcome Matthew Delmont to speak with us today, and also for me to have him here as a colleague in Claremont.
I appreciate everyone coming out. I know how busy it is this time of year, as I appreciate taking the time to come to my talk. I want to thank also the students who are in the seminar this afternoon. It was a really engaging discussion, and I appreciate it. I enjoyed my 7-minute walk over from Scripps. It's very close proximity. One of the funny things, one of the reasons I'm glad to be talking today is we don't get a chance as professors to talk very much about our own research here on campus. We go to conferences and talk to other folks, but we don't get a chance to talk about our own stuff here very often. My presentation today is my new project, and this is actually the first time talking about it publicly, which is a somewhat unusual thing for academics to do. This is very much a work in progress. But I think it's important. I think it ties in nicely with the series that Dan has organized this year. Most broadly, my work is interested in bringing together history and media studies, particularly television. Thinking about television as something that both shapes and is shaped by history. Right? So taking television history very seriously. And I wanted to sort of trace what that means through the talk today. The images I'll be showing, the TV clips I'll be showing, are from the Vanderbilt Television News Archives. I'm also happy to talk about what it means to work with non-traditional archival sources. All right, so I want to start here. Boycott the public schools. We're returning to this later. This is from Pontiac, Michigan. I want to think about how this became the dominant way to understand busing in the 1970s. This is why I want to focus on television. I think television helped to establish anti-busing, the anti-busing sentiment articulated here, as common sense. I think it did it in two ways. One, it presented the decision about busing or anti-busing without any historical context. Right? So it gave no history about the histories of segregation in these different communities, the histories of residential segregation in different communities. Without that, the anti-busing case emerged much stronger. Okay? That's point one. The second is that it presented frequent, and I would say largely sympathetic, coverage of anti-busing organizations. Right? So I'm only going to have a chance to show you a few clips today, but really from the late 1960s through the early 1980s, there were dozens of different examples of coverage of anti-busing, but they're almost all on the anti-busing side. There's very little support for busing, and we can get into the reasons why it is, but as it's presented through television, very little support for busing, very much opposition to busing, and that really emerged as a common sense. That's the big picture. why television? This actually didn't occur to me when Dan initially invited me to give the talk, but I think it fits nicely with schooling in mass societies because television is another one of those institutions that is fundamentally an institution of mass society. So I've highlighted here just a few of the places that were covered in television news coverage of busing decisions in the 1970s, right? To articulate a couple of points. One, this is a national story, right? So as this goes over the course of the 1970s, it doesn't matter so much if your town is dealing with busing right now. It matters that you're seeing Pontiac here, you're seeing Charlotte here, you're seeing Louisville here, you're seeing Boston here. Before it ever even comes to your town, you have ideas being shaped about busing, right? So this is one of the ways in which I think television can help us think about schooling in mass society, that television shapes popular perceptions of schooling. So that's why I'm particularly interested in television with regards to busing. I want to take a step back, though, because one of the things that historians have looked at is the way in which television played a favorable role in the civil rights movement. And I want to talk about why that is, because the anti-busing case is really the kind of the flip side of that, the polar opposite of it. Right? Identify just a few points. Hopefully these images will be familiar to you. Right? So this is one of the famous images from Little Rock. What we might not know, what we might have forgotten, is that Little Rock received national news coverage for a whole month, both in print but also in television. So it highlighted Philadelphia's television station. Television stations sent reporters there and covered it on a daily basis. This was one of the lead stories for the whole month in which it was developing. Daniel Shore described it as our national evening seance. You'd sit down, you'd watch the news about Little Rock. Right? Television played a favorable role for civil rights and then established it as a national story. It became something that wasn't just limited to Little Rock, but something that was being paid attention to across the nation. Other familiar images, attack by police officer in Alabama, and by firefighters in St. Louis. Thinking about civil rights, one of the ways in which nonviolence was persuasive is that you had vulnerable protesters, children and women, coming up against official armed forces. Right? This is part of the strategy of nonviolence. Stage these confrontations in which the sides of good and evil would be readily apparent. Right? This fit perfectly with television. Okay? Television, as it broadcasts these images, helped to shape clearly who was on the good side and who was on the bad side. Right? Thirdly and fourthly, television loved folks like Martin Luther King, right? A great speaker, dynamic public presence. One of the reasons, again, why civil rights was treated favorably to television. And thinking about mainstream civil rights here. The second, we just think about all the people here. It was great spectacle. Okay? You have marches. Part of the reason you organize large marches is to convey strength in numbers. Right? So it's important to contextually understand when we're talking about busing, to understand throughout a lot of the late 1950s, early 1960s, television helped advance the cause of the mainstream civil rights movement, and it was used sadly by civil rights activists to put forward their case. Now, I don't want to give the impression that television fixed all the problems of the civil rights movement or that the civil rights movement achieved all of its aims. Right? Humanity, decent housing, equal rights, jobs for all, decent pay, other times say, integrated education. All of those aims weren't achieved, right? But television did help to advance civil rights. To the extent you could say, when you had signed something like the Civil Rights Act in 1964, television played a large role in pushing that forward. Right? It put pressure on politicians to address the thing that their constituents were talking about. Their constituents were talking about it in part because television helps broadcast it. That's the snapshot that helps us understand television playing a more progressive role, we might say, with regards to civil rights, and everything with busing is sort of the polar opposite of that. So the question is, how do we get from that earlier period to here? And I want to focus on three general areas. There's a lot more I could say, but I want to focus on just three areas. And try to share with you some of the archival footage I'm working from, and give you a sense of how I'm trying to make sense of it. So for neighborhoods like this, neighborhoods like this, when I said it presented with a lack of historical context, one of the most important things it did was it did not discuss the history of residential segregation in the United States. Right? You can't understand the history of why busing decisions were implemented if you have no sense of why people came to live in different neighborhoods in the first place. Right? But the way in which television presented sort of a stark statement about you have these ghetto schools or these black schools, and then you have suburban white schools. They just happen to show up this way. I showed two short clips that make explicit reference to places that look like this and places that look like this. Okay? As you watch these, think about what is being said and what's not being said, and why, as a visual medium, this is important.
And it was caused by bus. In white middle-class neighborhoods like this, Many students who walked to their elementary school were ordered to ride buses to black schools. In neighborhoods like this, many black students.
Then almost exactly the same language in Nashville.
People who live in neighborhoods like this in Nashville and in most other places just don't want to send their kids to school a dozen miles away in neighborhoods like this. They would not do it voluntarily, and they want to find a way out of having to do it under pressure. For many whites, kids.
So it's not so much any individual clip in isolation, but it's a series of these, a series of repetition of how we're meant as viewers, historical viewers, to understand the case of school segregation, right? This is one of the first places to start.
In the initial clip,
Yeah.
what would they go on to say about what would happen to the black children?
So the black children are bused to the suburbs.
Yeah.
In the case of the Delmont.
Yeah.
Um,
They said what happened to them?
Yes. Yeah. And we can talk more about it. So one of the reasons many black students were opposed to it is that they were almost, so the Delmont would be one of the rare examples where children might be bused actually to schools as opposed to just busing black students out into the suburbs. We can talk more about that. That's one of the reasons black communities were not in favor of busing. The next clip comes from Memphis, and it picks up on the study of housing. Pay attention here to how the mayor talks about who could live in what kind of neighborhood.
One of the big American cities facing court-ordered school busing and where the issues generated lots of controversy is Memphis, Tennessee. New buses have been arriving there this week to enable authorities to carry out cross-town trips scheduled to begin next month. More on the story from ABC's Bill Worden.
White parents in Memphis are closing ranks to fight a court order which will soon send their children to all black schools far from their own homes. This is a small demonstration, but it is only the tip of the iceberg. For these are members of CAP, Citizens Against Busing, an organization which claims 5,000 members and thousands more sympathizers. The issue is simple. Many parents believe their children have a right to go to school in their own neighborhoods, and the mayor of Memphis agrees with them.
There's no desire on anybody's part of this government to give anyone any very education because they're black. We just have a feeling, the vast majority of people in this country, that everybody should be able to buy a house in their neighborhood and let their child go to the school in that neighborhood.
Memphis.
So the statement that's presented, everyone in the country believes that people should be able to buy a house in the neighborhood of their choice and go to school in the neighborhood of their choice. It sounds great in theory, and everyone would want to buy into that if it actually happened, but if we know anything about the history of the United States in the mid-century, vast numbers of people of color could not buy homes in the suburbs, right? So it's a statement about, well, this is how we think the world works, that's diametrically opposed to what's actually happening in cities like Memphis. A final clip in this section coming from Sterling Heights, which is just outside of Detroit, right? It's a slightly longer clip. Think here about how the opponents of busing are asking, again, viewers, but also people who are trying to rally, what the relationship should be of the suburbs to Detroit schools, right? Do the suburbs have any relationship to Detroit schools, or do they not have any responsibility?
A major issue George McGovern will have to face this fall is busing, and he'll have to face it just as schools are reopening across the country. A prime area in the busing dispute is Detroit, and Steve Delaney has a report on the situation there.
Sterling Heights is about 15 miles north of Detroit, a community of new apartments and neat middle-class homes with little pools in the backyards. Mario Giordano moved here 3 years ago because it's a nice place to live and put his children in school nearby. Now he's trying to keep them in school nearby. But a federal court order says children from places like Sterling Heights may be bused into the city of Detroit when school starts. Mario Giordano says his children won't go, and he's getting the neighbors to pledge their opposition too.
Mr. Giordano, member of Shum, concerned parent, and we're selling these pledges to try to get the people to unite against busing. And you got children?
Yes, 2 of them.
You interested in the pledge?
Yes, be glad to.
Right.
Very much.
The no-bus pledging is widespread in Sterling Heights. There are block captains to canvass every street, sign people up. The pledge is to boycott school if busing is ordered. include money for lawyers if and when parents are hauled into court for refusing to put their children on the school bus to Detroit. Last night, about 800 Sterling Heights people turned out for an anti-busing rally at their new high school and signed pledges and gave money. Most of them grew up in Detroit. They moved out here because they can afford to, barely, and because they don't like what's going on now in Detroit.
In Detroit, you have a city overflowing with high crime, muggings, murder, rape, constant robberies, police killings, very high school vandalism, extortion in the schools, a city abounding in drugs. What are the priorities of the NAACP? Why don't they use their power to clean up Detroit? But no, their first priority is to bus small children into this alien, hostile environment. In other words, they want us to share their misery.
They don't believe it's their fault that the Detroit school system is mostly black and getting blacker. And they don't believe the federal court ought to haul their children in from the next county to achieve a racial balance in Detroit. And they're being told the pledge system is going to stop all that.
When you buy this pledge, don't take it home and throw it in the drawer. That's not the purpose of it. Be proud that you've got the guts to stand up and fight for your freedom. Take it home and put it in your front window.
The anti-busing people have learned a lot since the Pontiac protest of last year. They're now organized. They think that by holding enough children out from enough suburbs, if busing into Detroit is ordered, they can beat this problem. They haven't done it yet, but they have a plan. Steve Delaney, NBC News.
So it probably won't surprise you to learn that Sterling Heights is an exclusively white community established because of real estate practices. Right? So to talk about do they have relationships with Detroit, well, their relationship that they left Detroit because they wanted to move to segregated white neighborhoods. So fundamentally, this is one of the most important things I think television does in terms of framing this issue, right? It starts with that neighborhoods like this, neighborhoods like this, with no context of why is this neighborhood segregated, why is this neighborhood segregated. But then it extends it, and there's no counterpoint to these anti-busing activists. No one's standing up for Detroit in this news coverage, right? So it fills in these simplistic categories how we should understand racial space with regards to schools, and then it allows the anti-busing activists to make claims about what's wrong with black communities and black schools and why they don't want to integrate. I want to provide a little bit more historical context for what's being left out here, and hopefully this will be familiar to some of you from other classes. And I'm going to bounce around a little bit with regards to geography, in part because it's where some of the good materials come from. Right? So I want to highlight just two ways in which neighborhoods like Sterling Heights became segregated. Right? The first are racial covenants. And this is coming from Seattle, a place we would usually think of as being fairly liberal. Racial covenants were legal for owners to write into deeds of their house until 1948. What changed in 1948 is courts could no longer uphold deeds, but private property owners and real estate agents could still discriminate on the basis of race up until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Right? So in the time in which these communities are taking shape, racial segregation in housing is perfectly legal. Right? You can see the language here couldn't be more explicit in terms of who is and is not allowed to move in neighborhoods. Who get salary and something like here. No part of said property hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied by any person of Ethiopian, Malay, or Asiatic race. Ethiopian is a reference to African American. This is not unique to Seattle, it's true across the country. Here's the language of one of these racial covenants. You can see what's interesting about this is that it starts out very kind of perfunctory, talking about the language of the land you're buying, right? So the western 20 feet, south 132 feet of track 12, blah, 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 right? City of Seattle, County of King. Then to call your attention to the very bottom here, the said property shall not be sold, leased, rented, or occupied, except to or by persons of the Aryan race. This is from 1945. These covenants stayed on the books. In some cases, they're still on the books today, but they stayed enforceable through 48 formally, and informally, they're enforceable through 1968. If you have no context in which to understand how neighborhoods became segregated, that anti-busing stuff makes a lot of sense. So covenants were extremely important. The other thing that's really important is mortgage redlining, and where the FHA decided to shoot money to, right? So the federal government played a huge role in shaping racial segregation. Here's some of the guidelines that guided Federal Housing Administration, their underwriting manuals, so deciding what was and was not a good place in which to lend money. I call your attention to D here. The degree of social and racial compatibility of the inhabitants of the neighborhood, the pressure of socially or racially harmonious groups in the neighborhood tends to lessen or destroy owner occupancy appeal. Right? In layperson's terms, mixed neighborhoods, integrated neighborhoods are a threat to property values. We should not lend money there. Right? This was explicit in how they carried out their approach to mortgage lending. The result of this, in Deputy Los Angeles, is what hopefully you're familiar with, the idea of mortgage redlining, right? So it marked out certain areas, green areas, as being the ones that are racially homogenous, white neighborhoods, that were worthy of mortgage lending, funding. It marked out other areas, red areas, that were racially mixed areas, or African American neighborhoods, or other communities of color, that were threats to property value, that weren't worth the money that the FHA was trying to lend, right? So this is where the language of redlining comes from. The importance of this is it determines who can and cannot get mortgages to live in different neighborhoods, right? If you were an African American up really through late 1950s, 1960s, you could not get a loan to live outside of certain neighborhoods, right? You did not have access to the neighborhoods that, like Sterling Heights, right? No sense of this in the television news coverage of it. Two quick quotations, I'll give you a sense of contemporary folks, what they were saying about FHA. This is from Charles Abrams, who is a professor at Columbia. He said, a government offering such bounty to builders and lenders could have required a compliance with the non-discrimination policy, or the agency could have at least pursued a course of evasion or hidden behind the screen of local autonomy. Instead, FHA adopted a racial policy that could well have been called the Nuremberg Clause. From its inception, FHA set itself up as a protector of the all-white neighborhood. It sent its agents into the field to keep Negroes and other minorities from buying houses in white neighborhoods. Right? So it's important here that FHA is a governmental institution. Right? This is federally funded. It's federally funded supporting the racial segregation of neighborhoods, right? That busing decisions were then meant to try to rectify. One other quotation from Clarence Mitchell and then Lewis P., also from 1950s. He said, what the Ku Klux Klan has not been able to accomplish by intimidation and violence, the present federal housing policy is accomplished through a monumental program of segregation in all aspects of housing which receive government aid. So, between racial covenants, between FHA lending policies, and then, if I had more time, the third aspect are homeowners groups that formed to block migration of people of color into neighborhoods. Those factors maintain racial segregation in neighborhoods, right? It's why Detroit was increasingly African American and Sterling Heights was white. It's why busing was deemed one of the only remedies that was possible to increase racial integration in schools, right? But you had none of this context in the television news coverage of it. The second point I want to make, the second of the 3 points I want to make, are the way in which this idea of a right to neighborhood schools, right? So very few people talked about a right to neighborhood schools until the topic of school integration came up. Right? And I want to talk about it in two veins. One at state and national politics, and then one at the local level, and then focus on Pontiac for that. Here, and again, if I had more time, I would show you a host of different examples. I want to highlight just 3 examples. It became political football isn't the right word. It became something that politicians, busing became something politicians returned to anytime they wanted to drum up votes in an election cycle. Right? Very few politicians came out forcefully in favor of busing because there were very few votes for it. Right? Whereas it came out vehemently anti-busing, quite a few people would rally to your side. Right? And I want to highlight just 3 folks who you'll be familiar with who took up this language. First, then Governor Reagan in California, who wrote the idea of forced busing as one of his key issues. And then Presidents Nixon and Ford. Again, it's not that television made them have these opinions, but that television provided a platform through which appeals to anti-busing messages would be persuasive. Right? So first, Ronald Reagan from 1970.
The school busing controversy took 2 forms in California today. The start of a massive busing program in Pasadena and the signing of a state anti-busing law to take effect November 21st. Harry Drinkwater reports.
Governor Ronald Reagan set the stage today for another court test in California of busing to achieve school integration. He signed a bill to outlaw busing without the consent of the parents of each student.
Judicial rulings intended to force compulsory busing on parents and families against their wishes without their consent have distressed the vast majority of our citizens who strongly oppose racial discrimination, but who understandably view mandatory busing as a ridiculous waste of time and public money, which could seriously undermine all efforts to improve the quality of our public schools. Besides hampering the quality of education, our children need and deserve by siphoning off millions of dollars in school funds which could otherwise be used for books, new classrooms, teachers, and maintenance. Forced busing would also deprive them of the natural environment of the neighborhood schools.
One of the things to pay attention to here is that the language of explicit race-based appeals doesn't really show up much in the 1970s, right? So there's things like neighborhood schools, things like forced busing being a trampling of my individual rights as a taxpayer, as an American, as a parent, fill in the blank, right? It's important because it allows folks to say, you know, I'm not in favor of segregation, I'm just opposed to busing. Here is President Nixon echoing very similar sentiments.
The bill does not do two things the President has demanded. It doesn't declare a moratorium on court-ordered school busing for integration, and it doesn't prevent future such federal court decisions. So the President today again warned Congress that he plans an election year fight on this.
This bill contains a wholesale retreat by the Congress from responsibility on school busing. Congress has refused to put a limit to court orders busing small children under 11 out of their neighborhoods. Congress has granted no relief whatsoever to school districts which have been ordered by the courts to institute massive busing programs. This is not good enough. Cross-city and cross-county busing is wrong. It is harmful to education. It does not unite races and communities. It divides them. If Congress continues to refuse to act on the proposal I have made to solve this problem, a moratorium on all busing orders, we will have no choice but to seek a constitutional amendment which will put the goals of better education for all of our children above the objective of massive busing for some children.
Yep. And then President Ford from 1976.
President Ford made a quick and, according to the White House, a non-political trip today to speak to the National JC Convention in Indianapolis. Most of his words were key to the bicentennial, but at one point he again attacked massive busing.
There's no good reason why we cannot wipe out the vestiges of discrimination in America, achieve quality education for our children, and at the same time minimize the massive busing of our children. A few of our courts have wandered so far into the school busing controversy that they are practically running our local school board.
I played those just three quick examples. You can find examples from a number of different states. Governor Kirk in Florida, for example. Anytime politicians needed an issue to try to drum up sort of an emotional appeal, in the 1970s, busing was their go-to thing. Right? There's very little opposition to that at an official political level. The president of Notre Dame at the time, Father Hesper, who was the chair of the Civil Rights Commission, who shows up on national television voicing an opinion that, you know, you can't say that you're against segregation and also say that you're against busing, because busing is the only thing short of actually moving people around in terms of homes that's going to create integrated schools. Right? Except that very few politicians, no politicians, come out forcefully in favor of busing. So again, it's that repetition of the anti-busing message that becomes increasingly persuasive through television. My last section, I want to look at local organizing. So the last thing I think television does, particularly important with regards to busing, is that it gives frequent and largely sympathetic coverage to numerous different anti-busing organizations which show up across the country. I'm just going to focus on Pontiac, Michigan here, but I can focus on a number of different cities. Boston, of course, is the most famous. One thing to pay attention to is it is largely the mirror of the civil rights movement, right? So it's not as largely well developed, but in terms of presenting what's at stake. Well, my rights are at stake. My rights are being violated, right? Who is potential victim? The children are victims, right? 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds who are going to be bussed across town. This is one of the common figures. Women play a large role in organizing and leading these movements. The numbers weren't as large, but they received the type of favorable coverage that had just 10 years earlier been granted for civil rights. So I'm focusing on Pontiac for a couple of reasons. One, it's one of the earliest and largest organizations to get a significant amount of news coverage. The second, they have a very charismatic leader named Irene McCabe, who will show up here making very persuasive sounding to our audience arguments against busing. So I think it's important to pay attention to her as a figurehead for the
reporter in Los Angeles. Good evening.
More buses took more integration to more schools today, and the country seems to be getting used to the idea. Not Pontiac, Michigan, apparently, where Murray Thompson reports.
The angry debate over integration in Pontiac erupted with a series of explosions and fires that demolished 10 of the buses scheduled to be used on the first day of school, September 7th. The buses were parked in a lighted lot belonging to the Board of Education. No injuries were reported. Dynamite charges were placed under a number of the buses. The explosions apparently triggered simultaneously. The state police bomb squad searched for evidence that might lead to the dynamite. The FBI is also investigating. This morning, the school superintendent said the busing would go ahead despite the bombing. But the city is asking the Supreme Court to overturn the lower court integration order, arguing it will cause whites to abandon Pontiac. 8,000 of the city's 24,000 children are to be bused out of their neighborhoods, and arguments over the plan have been vocal and persistent.
The freedom of our country has been destroyed. We don't even have freedom of choice anymore. I don't feel like my kid should have to be forced to go to school that he's not interested in. He's leaving the school within 3 blocks from home. We just don't live with him.
I think the white community is showing more of a strong reaction against busing right now than the black community. I don't think the blacks want busing as per se, but I don't think they would show this type of reaction to the white community.
Well, I've been very much against busing ever since they first mentioned it, and well, I'm just kind of proud of whoever done this. I don't know.
So Pontiac wasn't the only place where they bombed buses. They bombed buses in Denver, in Louisville, police that have find so far, potentially other places as well. What's interesting about how it's presented in the news is that it's presented as though it's not a shocking development. Right? This is an obvious way in which one would protest a judicial decision is that you should go and bomb buses that are in a bus drive. Right? And the next two clips I want to play trace the development of the Pontiac organization. So this is early in the development, then we'll start to see as they become more organized, more visible public protests of busing as a means to desegregate.
With another wave of school openings coming tomorrow, many communities are struggling with the complex and highly emotional problem of busing. Bob Barr was in Pontiac, Michigan, where the issue brought protesters into the streets today.
This is the third time in a week that Pontiac has seen a public protest against court-ordered busing. Last Monday, explosives destroyed 10 empty school buses. 2 nights later, an anti-busing rally attracted several thousand persons to the local stadium. Today, on the day before school opens, about 6,000 persons marched. Under the court's plan, close to 9,000 of Pontiac's 24,000 students would be bused to achieve better racial balance. Critics of the plan here say it's unnecessary, too expensive, and will eventually drive whites out of Pontiac.
So again, thinking about this nationally, right? So this is 1971 in Pontiac. It emerged later in Boston, or emerged later in Louisville, emerged later in Charlotte. You might get a town, Minneapolis, let's say, it doesn't actually start implementing these things until the late 1970s, early 1980s. These can't not shape your opinion about what busing is about. It doesn't determine that you're going to be against busing, but if this is the only message coming through the national news, I'd have to argue that it's shaping public perception in one direction, not the other. One final clip from Pontiac. This is a march that Irene McCabe led of mothers to Washington, D.C. Right? So again, using the March to Washington as a sort of a hallmark of civil rights movement. This is a much smaller march, but think about, again, 2.5 minutes of news coverage for a march that draws 1,500 people. What's going on?
A A group of mothers from Michigan today completed a 44-day walk to Washington to protest school busing. They were followed by a smaller group who had hiked more than 100 miles from Richmond, Virginia, and they were joined by sympathizers from several other states. Tony Sargent reports.
The marching mothers reached Capitol Hill after 620 miles of walking from Pontiac, Michigan, spending each night in motels along the way. They came to urge House action on an anti-busing constitutional amendment. 65 more congressmen's signatures would force it to a House vote. Their leader is Irene McCabe, housewife and mother, who's refused since last fall to let her own daughter be bused to another school. Mrs. McCabe and the others all had foot and leg problems along the way, some requiring doctor's care. But discomfort was forgotten amid the cheers. Among legislators greeting Mrs. McCabe was House Republican leader Gerald Ford, who said he thought she'd be successful. Also on hand, Republican William Brock of Tennessee, sponsoring the anti-busing amendment in the Senate, and Congresswoman Louise Day Hicks, the anti-busing champion from Massachusetts. The marchers then moved from the Capitol to a rally near the Washington Monument. Despite perfect weather, only about 1,500 persons showed up, but Mrs. McCabe was undaunted.
I can't believe we walked the whole way.
Mrs. McCabe told the crowd she was speaking as a mother.
Whenever you're in labor, you finally give birth to something beautiful. We've labored long, and we've been through a great deal of pain, but it's worth it. Because we have given birth now to the rekindling of the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Look, you're here.
Despite Mrs. McCabe's dramatic march, today's turnout was far smaller than expected. So another rally has been scheduled for Saturday afternoon near the White House. Tony Sargent, CBS News, Washington.
That's the way it is. Thursday, April 27th, 19.
So I focused on Pontiac. I could have selected other cities, but the point is that these organizations received extensive news coverage. There's never any questioning or qualifications of the claims they were making. It was essentially mini advertisements for their cause. Right? Show them again and again in different communities. Right? As in still images of other communities, just to give you a sense of how this language became very prominent. I still am trying to tease out the ways in which groups were sharing knowledge across state lines, but certainly the language they were using was almost synonymous across the different protests. First, the language of forced busing, right? I'll return to what that language draws on in a second, but first, the language of forced busing shows up Detroit, Boston, almost everywhere this is protested. Second, I'm not sure of the explicit reference here as far as drunk judges. I don't know if the judge of England had an alcohol problem, but language of activist judges shows up again and again. So these court decisions are presented as coming from up on high. We never get a sense of why the court was considering this question in the first place. It's just the court decided this, now everyone's protesting it. There's no context for which we can understand the role of the judiciary in this process. Right? But again, stop forced busing. Finally, I know this one's a little bit difficult to read. This is Boston. Sign here on the left. What about the rights of white people? If I had more time, I could point you a series of different quotations from Buffalo, from Louisville, from a number of different cities where people are saying, what about our rights? Don't white people have any rights? And then again, this t-shirt, stop forced busing. So there are two key things. It's the idea of rights, right? The idea that these homeowners, these white citizens, white suburbanites, have rights that are being trampled. And then second, it's being trampled because of forced busing. So to conclude, I just want to point to where that language is drawing from. It's drawing most explicitly from folks who organized to oppose the Civil Rights Movement. This is an advertisement that the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission took out in newspapers across the country in 1963 to protest the national civil rights bill, the thing that we usually hold as a landmark of the greatness or the possibility for our nation to rectify past bills. People forget a whole bunch of people opposed it, right? Senators filibustered the hell out of it. And folks like this group in Mississippi opposed it vehemently, but get into the language in which they opposed it and how that language gets picked up later, but ostensibly without regards to race. Right? So the American people are being set up for a blow that would destroy their right to determine for themselves how they will live. Right? Now that right is the right to segregate your neighborhood and segregate your school. That's explicitly the right to which they're returning. But it's important that it's not just Mississippi. Right? So this we tend to, and hopefully folks don't think this anymore, we tend to think of racism as being located in the American South, but of course it's not. One of the ways you can see how it's not is understanding the opposition folks had to open housing legislation in places like Seattle and Los Angeles. And here's where the language of forced busing into it. That language was drawing on earlier protests against open housing laws, so the language of forced housing. So these were laws that different states passed before there was a national anti-discrimination law with respect to housing that tried to rectify the racial covenants I mentioned earlier, the racist real estate practices, the rampant discrimination that was going on in housing. These were state laws that tried to oppose that, but then were either opposed or overturned by popular votes. This is Seattle, again, essentially a progressive state. An advertisement that's supporting housing segregation. So before deciding on the forced housing ordinance, the wise voter will examine human rights and property rights. Protect your human rights, vote against an ordinance. Right? Again, it's what are your rights? Your human rights are your property rights, which are your right to discriminate and segregate your neighborhood and segregate your school. Right? This is the language that forced busing was drawing on. This is the language of rights that they're One last one here. This is from California. So California passed the Rumford Fair Housing Act, but then was overturned or repealed through Prop 14 by a 2/3 majority. Later found unconstitutional, but as a sense of where the majority of voters, the majority of white voters were at, this is a pretty clear state. So here, the Rumford Fair Housing Act, the Rumford Fair Housing Act police arm is long and strong. It can reach almost any Californian, almost anyone who owns or rents a place to live. Owner, tenant, yes, and neighbor too. First reaches the owner. It takes away his right to choose his tenants or buyers. Again, this is explicitly the debate that's going on. Do you have the right to discriminate with regards to selling your home, choosing your neighbors, where you'll live? And then the extension of that, do you have the right to say you want to have a segregated school? That's explicitly what the anti-busing folks were saying. Let me rephrase that. That's actually what the anti-busing folks were saying, but that wasn't made explicit in the way in which it was presented in television news. Right? This is not the message that came across in television news. The message was, don't send my kid across town because it might be harmful. Don't ask me how I came to live in a segregated white neighborhood. It just happened. Good luck with the drawing comes, right? This is a disconnect that I think television is important for. Right? It shaped the way. I'm not saying it determined solely, but it shaped the way folks were going to view issues like residential segregation and school segregation. Two slides to conclude. Again, why television is important. It's a national story that develops over the course of a decade, right? So it's not any isolation of a single image that would change people's minds, but it's or to line them up in sort of anti-busing versus pro-busing. There's a huge number across all different parts of the country, across the entire swath of the late 60s to the early 80s that are anti-busing, very few that are pro-busing. Right? If television has any role in shaping public perception, it shaped it in favor of anti-busing. And finally, returning here, thinking about the larger implications of this topic, I think there are two that I'd like to highlight. The first is the idea of historical amnesia. George Lipsitz, in talking about in an article called Getting Around Brown, how it came to be we had the Brown versus Ford decision, but then 50 years later, school districts are more segregated than they ever have been. Right? He describes what he calls an epistemology of ignorance, right? That we don't want to know how things actually happen. We don't actually want to know how neighborhoods outside of the South became segregated. Right? We don't want to know how that segregation was maintained through anti-busing policy. Right? I think the first thing that this is important for is that it gives us a better sense of how the history of school segregation actually developed, how it was maintained. Right? That people opposed the civil rights movement and people opposed racial integration. That usually falls out of the dominant narrative we have of progress in American history of racial relations, but it's fundamental understanding the condition of schools today. Secondly, I think if nothing else, this case study of anti-busing is a decade plus long attack on the idea of public school. Right? At least the idea of public school mattering for someone who's not your own kids. I think when we think about the role media can play in terms of having investment in or optimism or pessimism about public schools, I think this is a good place to look. One of the fundamental challenges I would say we face now is getting people to care. I wouldn't exclude myself from this. Getting people to care about public schools if your kids don't attend that specific public school. Right? If you don't have kids yet, if you have kids that attend this school and not that school, why should you care about what's going on across town? Right? Media helps shape the way in which people give attention and give their enthusiasm, give their energies right? Not just monetary energies, but investments, right? Their emotional investment in schools. Media helps to shape that. And I think looking at this anti-busing stuff, we get a sense of how media played a role historically, how it might be able to play a role contemporarily as well. Thank you for being a nice audience.
How did they decide which students would be bused?
It varied based on communities. So in many places it was a lottery. In some places they had explicit numbers from different schools that had to be bused. And part of it's an important maybe contextual point is busing was not explained particularly well to different communities. Right? I think there are a lot of flaws with busing as an approach. One of them was that they often would come in communities and just say, all right, these 5 kids need to go this place, these 5 kids need to go this place, with little explanation for why it was selected that way, or little explanation for even the communities what this was meant to rectify. So after that, it seemed somewhat arbitrary to many of the people who were impacted by it.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to think about the television aspect of your story, and to, on one hand, you show that television sort of does not portray the history that explains these things. The television in the same period is also not showing the history of the war in Vietnam or contextualizing the protests against the war. So, I think in some ways, in a sort of visual rhetorical style, those are important models for what you're seeing here.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly true. So it's it's not an isolated case in which television is ahistorical, right? I think what's important is it's still the period in which television news is watched by a lot of folks, right? It's trying to make sense of what does that decontextualization, that dehistoricalization mean for this topic, right? But certainly it's rampant for television as a whole.
I was trying to talk about the math. I know the whole talk is really fascinating, but I was just trying to talk about the math. I was just thinking of older TV. I think one of the questions around TV is the discourse, that the older television sort of played out to the south and the north. And one thing that I didn't get a sense of is like so much of the discourse is also like Little Rock of the North, or constantly sort of regional distinctions, and so much of the actual busing legislation and the way the court cases are decided on those kind of is based on that on a really complicated set of factors. So I'm wondering how the news made sense of this is national. Like what you see the role is in kind of saying that actually California and Michigan and Charlotte and Daytona are the same. So what role it plays in bringing the nations together, kind of away from the median debate?
Yeah, it's a very good question. If I could have showed longer clips, it does do more of the, isn't this interesting that this happened in Pontiac? It's outside of the South. Right? So when it made reference to these places that are outside of the South, it does kind of you thought this was going in the South, but now it's here. Right? But it keeps coming back to me even after watching the news 2 years earlier, you would have known it wasn't just in the South. So it keeps coming back to those tropes again and again.
So you don't see it as kind of transcending that? You don't see the news as kind of making it transcending that, those distinctions?
I think I need to think more about it, honestly, because I need to sit down and watch them all kind of together again. Because it's doing both in some ways, right? Because some cases it is saying, isn't it interesting that's happening in Pontiac, or isn't it interesting that's happening in Boston, right? But then there comes a point where almost all of it is outside of the South, right? And so it doesn't, they don't differentiate off. They'll run through a series of stories. So they might do 3 of these stories back to back, right? Without any sort of sense of we're moving from here to here. They're all very similar types of stories. But I think that was something to think more about.
I was just going to say, it's fascinating. I am a product of school break from 72 to 79. So I was the first generation. And I never really thought of it in the context of television. Very interesting. So I have a lot of answers to how they came down and how we were selected. But it's interesting because from a television perspective, I was a child, so I didn't really have that perspective. In my neighborhood, it was mixed emotions. It was better opportunity, okay. We don't want to be bused 2 hours away to San Fernando Valley, but we'll try.
Yeah.
And so, I now see the neighborhoods from both sides as to what has happened. So it's fascinating to hear your research. I think it's amazing and how it has shaped my look at where I live in schools, which is very, very strong. But very, very much, I think it gave us a sense of what equality is. And most of the folks that I went to school with from all races we consciously strive for equal balance, not slant it one way or the other. It's very equal.
Yeah. I'd love to talk to you more about
I love to talk to you. I came to recruit for CGU, and I didn't know I was going to get such an interesting relationship.
If I could say two quick things to pick up on that, I didn't have a chance to show one of the other tropes they would use. They would interview a white family and a black family as sort of representatives of how busing is progressing. But for folks who had a non-dramatic experience where their buses weren't bombed, where people weren't throwing dirt at them, it received very little coverage, right? So that one Pontiac clip I showed where he says, busing unfolded today across the country, already without problems, 5 seconds. And now, buses being bombed in Pontiac, right? This emphasis, not just decontextualization or lack of history, but emphasis on crisis, right? When are things going bad, that's when television is going to pick up the story, as opposed to, 95% of the cases it worked okay. People might not be excited about it, but it worked okay. Focusing on those crisis stories.
Was there a similar movement towards the desegregation of the housing system as it was in the education system? Do you know that kind of really remove the problem, or was it kind of just like, let's focus on the schooling rather than the housing system?
Initially, there's much more weight, so this is part of driven by the NAACP and their sort of legal arm of the school cases. There's much more weight given to school cases. But in this emerges on really a state-by-state or city-by-city basis. Civil rights activists throughout most of the 40s, 50s, and 60s are pushing for things like the fair housing laws. They're extremely hard to come by. So in Philadelphia, the case that I know best, I mean, they're trying to cobble something together from World War II, 1945, up and through the 1960s. And there's so many people who are opposed to it, right, that they have to make so many concessions. So we're going to exclude owner-occupied dwellings of this type, right? We're going to exclude apartment units. We're going to exclude this. There comes a point that it only opens up another 10% of the housing market, right? So there's tremendous opposition to it. So people are pushing for them. It's not as much a topic as schools, but it was a primary topic for it.
Sorry. Has any of your research also led you to media coverage of contemporary vulnerable justice systems like the Manhattan system in LA, etc.?
It is not yet, because I always say that I'd love to think more about that. I think particularly because this historical amnesia around housing segregation still continues to show up, right? So if you look at the court's decision in 2007 that made about Seattle and Louisville, right? Chief Justice John Roberts, his decision reads as though there's never been a history of housing segregation in the United States, right? Which is fundamentally untrue, but I'm interested in thinking more about how the story really comes up in the investigation.
I'm just curious whether or not you contextualize this work in a meaning about busing and kind of about interviews and about busing as a tool for desegregation, whether or not it's effective.
That's another thing I think I need to think more about. So I think my argument is not busing is the best, was or is the best policy, but I think where we're at now is that given the context of where the judicial decisions were being made, right, and given the history that came up to it, I think busing was one of the only means I could imagine that would actually encourage school integration. Right? The other thing I would say, and this is one of the things that a number of black community activists have said, that we don't care which school students go to as long as that school has resources, right? The problem with that argument is that there was no surer means to get those resources to the school than it was to get the busing system, right? So like, I'm cool with either option, right? Actually having equal funding for schools for working class and students of color, or having a busing system that would level the playing field in some way. They both present political challenges.
Why do you think that the media has so constantly turned a blind eye towards residential segregation? Do you think that it's just from a view of privilege, not wanting to acknowledge it, or simply just apathy?
I'd say maybe three things. One, it's a complicated story, right? It's one that I think is only really sort of pieced together fully. I mean, so I was able to provide some quotes. I mean, people are aware of this in the 40s and 50s, but as sort of getting the evidence together to make a persuasive case on it, it's emerged over a period of decades, people doing scholarship on it. A second reason, maybe I only have two reasons, I'm not sure, is that it's not an mission statement of what television is about, right? It's these long-form explorations into complicated subjects is not native to television's focus, right? It doesn't help them sell products, right, fundamentally. Third, it ties in, I think, to how somebody sort of presented. Almost all of it was narrated through what are white folks going to do, right? If we have these bus decisions, white folks might leave, right? why is that the basis on which we should make decisions about policy, right? But television has almost always addressed an audience as a national white audience. Okay? So in thinking about what kind of programming they're going to make for that audience, those are, so I guess it depends on reasons. But.
I mean, part of your story is how the resistors to civil rights for African Americans, in some sense, got soured and dropped language of hate and bigotry and adopted race-neutral language of rights. You tell that as a shift in their opposing earlier policies to opposing busing. Did that also take place in opposition to busing, so that there's an earlier moment where there's less successful attacks on busing by white groups which are using that older language, a more racist language, overtly, and that they then shift within the critiques of busing to a racist language? Or does that take place across the topics, the way you presented it?
It takes place across the topics, and as early, actually, I'm sure guys are jumping here, so it takes place as early as the 1950s, really. In Philadelphia, the case that I know about from my previous book, groups are aware that civil rights organizations are spying. So white groups are aware that civil rights organizations are spying or coming to their meetings, right? So they're purposely using race-neutral language to oppose policies. This is true for school boards as well. They have sort of nominally colorblind policies that still take account of race with regards to drawing racial boundaries and assigning students. So as early, if not completely, in the 1950s, they start to adopt this race-neutral language that emerges dominantly by the 1970s.
But I think the other thing, and it's important to sorry to jump in, but I mean, you showed really clearly how they're drawing like anti-busing groups. They're also they're drawing on the civil rights movement language too, and tactics. And they're seeing how effective those tactics are and how it's working. And so I think that's the other thing that leads really early to taking on just like this race-neutral language and really taking away from it.
I'm from Wood, and so I was home from graduate school the summer before court-ordered busing, and the KKK got involved in the situation. And once that happened, a lot of people who were not so favorably disposed to busing wanted to separate themselves from the Klan, which is kind of interesting. So actually, my best friend's father was leading the demonstration against the Klan. So he and I went down and went across the street and checked out the Klan rally too. That's another story.
I know it's really a question, but something I thought that was really interesting that was like through the videos was like the main political actors of the sort of anti-busing movement being these like what was said in the videos as like these housewives and like the role of like these like the mothers of these children and like the significance of like these housewives marching from Pontiac all the way to Washington. I thought that was really interesting, and I was wondering if that was something that you're sort of looking into more. Was like the cultural significance of having someone like Irene McCabe as like the sort of the main actor in that anti-busing, and like the sort of in terms of like television and like the sort of cultural significance of that.
Yeah, I'm very glad you picked up on it. Something that is going to be a much larger part of the story. The short women played a huge role in the conservative movement, right? In the rise of politics of this sort, right? Women who did not otherwise have a public political persona, they took on issues like this as their issues and organized among their neighborhood, right? And I still need to think through a bit more of how that resonated when it reaches that national. I should say, if we close early, if I don't have time to answer your question, I will.
There's also, after a couple more questions, we have a reception outside where people can continue to ask questions for us. Maybe take 2 more questions.
Add to Lucia's point about, I was thinking in the footage, the historical footage they showed in Mill, the movie Mill, the woman who, and I'm forgetting her name, who's leading the homosexual integration, the teacher. She looks exactly like her. But I don't know, it just seems like the media has figured out exactly who it is that they want to spearhead, their movements, and who's watching them, they sort of align like the two. And it seems very odd to me that they are so similar.
Yeah, another good connection.
From this, I just saw like so many similarities to what's going on with the Tea Party, and people like Glenn Beck going to the Lincoln Memorial to speak. And the rhetoric, like there was one guy wearing like a triangle hat that the like early colonial people would wear. It's the same rhetoric, but they're not. But they're saying like we're not talking about race at all, but they say things like our America. What do they mean by our America or our rights? So
yeah, another thing I'm glad you picked up on, right? Is explicitly echoing, right? Around sort of the rights that are being trampled on even some of the most privileged people in the history of the world. Right? But also the evacuation, using this goes back to Lily's point, is using language and symbols that resonate, right? So going to the Washington Monument, but evacuating the history of what the actual civil rights movement was about.